I somewhat stumbled into prisoner work. My supervisor one day gave me a letter from an attorney for an incarcerated man who'd been in prison for more than 30 years for stealing approximately $35.
Hello and welcome to MentorTalks. My name is Asha Bay. I'm your host from the Office of Alumni Affairs in the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs at the U.S. Department of State.
And my name is Maria Iliadis, your co-host from the Office of Alumni Affairs. Our office opens the door to the million-strong Exchange Alumni Network, professional development, and grant opportunities for alumni of U.S. government educational and cultural exchange programs.
MentorTalks is your chance to connect with Exchange Alumni leaders, hear their stories, and get their career advice.
Today, in honor of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, we're talking to two Exchange alumni who fight for civil rights and are engaging the next generation in civic participation.
Dr. Brian MacHarg is the Director of Academic Civic Engagement at the Appalachian State University, also known as App State. He teaches classes on service, civil discourse, and education, and has taught many courses abroad. Brian was the co-director of the Mandela Washington Fellowship Program at App State from 2016 to 2022. He's an Exchange alumni of the U.S. Speakers Program, through which he has given talks on service learning, civic participation, and citizenship. Arienne Jones is an attorney and the Senior Program Manager for Justice and Equity at the Aspen Institute Forum for Community Solutions, where she works to address issues in the criminal legal system. Ari is an Exchange alumni of the Fulbright Scholar Program, having completed her Fulbright in Spain in 2012. Welcome, Brian and Ari.
Thanks for joining us on MentorTalks.
Glad to be here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Ari, let's start with you. How and why did you get involved with your work on prisoners and human rights?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I went to law school knowing that I was going to work in the public sector in civil rights and public interest, possibly for a governmental agency, which is ultimately what happened with my prisoner work. And I knew this because I know inherently that I'm put here to be of service to the world. And so with great privilege and great blessing comes great responsibility. And so using this advanced degree was the easiest way I knew to be of service. So during my time at the Cook County State's Attorney's Office in Chicago, I somewhat stumbled into prisoner work. My supervisor one day gave me a letter from an attorney for an incarcerated man who'd been in prison for more than 30 years for stealing approximately $35. And you don't really know injustice. You know that there are issues in the criminal legal system, but you don't really deeply understand that until you're confronted with issues like that. Why is a man serving a life sentence for what ultimately was a drug-related issue? He stole the money to feed his addiction in the 1980s in the midst of the crack epidemic. And so I started trying to figure out ways that we could possibly help him get released. And ultimately, he was released in the first half of 2020 through a grant of clemency from the governor. And that's really what began my prisoner work. His case was not an anomaly. It was not an exceptional story. There are far more instances than any of us can imagine of people who've received these unjustly long sentences for crimes that really stemmed from poverty, from addiction, from mental health issues, from trauma. And so how do we begin to address that? And sitting as I did in a powerful role in the state's attorney's office and a prosecutor's office, where there is an exorbitant amount of power to shape the criminal legal system, was really an opportunity for me to do that, for me to use this power, this almost disproportionate power, to remedy some of the wrongs that the office itself helped cause.
We're part of actually creating a bill, right, to encourage that.
Yes. So in 2021, the governor signed into law what was then called Senate Bill 2129, which I wrote. It is Illinois' version of what is called prosecutor-initiated resentencing. So it allows prosecutors at their discretion to ask a judge to resentence an incarcerated person when the prosecutor no longer believes the sentence is just, that there is no real reason for a person to remain incarcerated. So Illinois became the fourth, excuse me, state in the nation to have this law after California, Washington State, and Oregon. Washington, D.C. also has something similar, but it has an age limit to it, I believe.
That's fantastic. And it's really, it feels like a human rights issue, which is why, we brought both of you in to talk today. Brian, your work is really focused on civic responsibility and civic duty. How does that connect with human rights and the problems that we have in our societies?
Yeah, I mean, I view civic engagement as simply everyday people identifying problems that they see in their communities and developing a solution and responding to those problems. And, anyone can do that. And that includes a child who maybe doesn't like trash on their playground, or it could be, teenagers who want to increase tutoring in their school and develop something, or they want to do a fundraiser of some kind. But, I would suggest that any problem that one identifies, one can make some movement on and be empowered to be a citizen in that way. I don't think it's my place to tell somebody what they should be concerned about necessarily. I have my issues that I'm concerned about, but everyone has something that, bothers them in their heart. And so if they feel that there's an injustice or something that just needs to be fixed or could be improved, then people, I think, should be empowered to be able to act on that. And so that really is what civic engagement is saying, I am going to raise my hand and I'm going to be the one that attempts to solve this problem and identify this issue that I've seen in my community.
And Brian, what are some of the ways that people can address a problem where they see injustice?
Yeah, so I like to speak to students here, but also when I have the privilege of talking with audiences around the world about the social change wheel. It's a model that was developed by Minnesota Campus Compact. And you can take any issue that is of concern to you and think about the multitude of ways that we can address those. Now, students in the US very often think in terms of like charitable volunteerism, and that's great, right? Like, oh, I'm concerned about homeless issues, so I'm going to go serve food or pack lunches at the homeless shelter. I'm concerned about my elderly neighbors, so I'm going to spend time at the nursing home. That's great, charitable volunteerism. But there are many other ways that we can think about doing it, and the Campus Compact Social Change Wheel helps us think about that. So we can consider activism. We can consider encouraging people to vote on issues that are of concern to them. We can engage in fundraising or philanthropic efforts. We can think about social entrepreneurship, in which I run a business and I want to make sure that I'm a good corporate citizen. And so we have a brewery here in Boone, North Carolina, that donates a significant portion of its profits to help the environment. It's a good social entrepreneur. Community development, where we say we really want to invest in communities. And I know Ari, I think, is from Lawndale. I heard about a person down in Lawndale who wanted to open up a Giordano's down there just to get a pizza parlor in Lawndale, in a community that had various struggles. And so jobs are created and people have a place to sit and enjoy pizza, and that money is generated in the community. There could be just sort of advocacy. There's a research that academics and journalists can do to provide important data to solve problems. We can think about our personal social daily behavior as a way of thinking about addressing social issues. I'm concerned about the environment. Maybe I want to eat a vegetarian diet, or my consumer choices are going to be a little bit different. Or we just want to simply build community in small ways. I talk with students sometimes here on a university campus about like, hey, is there something you can do in your dorm to bolster morale or something like that? That's okay. That's a good way to affect positive change. It doesn't always have to mean going out and working in Geneva with the United Nations. Let's start small and then work big. So I would just suggest that wheel is one way to help us think about other ways that we could potentially affect positive social change if we have issues that reside in our heart that concern us, that we want to address.
I think those are good concrete steps that anyone can put in action.
Yeah, and those small steps can definitely lead to something bigger as well, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the hope, right? Sometimes I think we can get overwhelmed thinking, these problems are too big for me. What do we do about climate change? And what do we do about, we see migrations of refugees or just some huge problem that does trouble us. And yeah, ultimately, we want to work toward those solutions and maybe be in a position where we can affect positive change on those huge levels. But I also don't think we should discourage ourselves from saying, what can I do in my small little world, in my apartment building, at my school, in my workplace, or in my neighborhood, or at the park where I see kids hanging out down the street. And we start small and then potentially work bigger. I mean, it's the old adage, think globally, but act locally.
I'd like to jump to Ari for a moment, actually, with this question, because I feel like it fits in with the theme. So your work is focusing on educated young people, especially right now, with one of the programs right now at the Aspen Institute. Could you tell us more about that? And I know part of it is on back-end reform. So could you explain that to us in your answer and tell us how we and young people can take those small steps to advocate for reforms as concerned citizens?
I serve as the inaugural Senior Program Manager for Justice and Equity at the Aspen Forum for Community Solutions. So it's a program under the Aspen Institute. And overall, the program works with what's called opportunity youth. So youth and young adults ages 16 to 25 who are traditionally formally disconnected from either education, so they haven't at least attained their high school diploma or GED, and from the formal workforce. And so the overall goal is to get those youth and young adults re-engaged with both of these things, but also to work with them as partners to ensure that they have a life that is really what they want, and that this nation is meeting their needs, their base needs, their deeper needs, even their wants sometimes, with the understanding that the world that we occupy today is really for them tomorrow. So in my role as program manager for justice and equity, I work on our justice portfolio. So on behalf of and with community organizations that are working with those opportunity youth who are either justice involved, were justice involved, or are at risk of so being. And so some of the projects that the organizations with whom I work have done include a first chance hiring program for youth and young adults to begin to enter a career pipeline and not just a job pipeline. One is where public libraries are seeking ways to use this like radically beautiful and open public space to serve the needs of those three categories of youth, and so on and so forth. And I'm also working to figure out how can we center the voices of this particular demographic of youth. Studies have shown repeatedly that youth and young adults who start out with justice involvement at a young age are at risk of continuing that. And in my former work, I certainly saw that. An arrest at the age of 12 leads to a longer prison sentence at the age of 18, which leads to an even longer one at the age of 30. Because once you enter this criminal legal pipeline, it's really hard to get out of. So how do we work to remove you from this pipeline completely? For those who are currently system involved, how do we limit that system involvement? What is it that you need to ensure that you are going to be, this is going to be a one and done for you? For instance, in Buffalo, an organization that my job works with is doing amazing work to open a community center so that when youth and young adults are picked up by the police, they can be taken to the community center without charges. And the community center will work to figure out, well, why were you trying to steal this money? What is it that you need? Do you need food? Do you need shelter? Do you need to be placed in the home of a safer guardian? How can we address the root issues of the reason that you did or were about to commit this crime so that we end this cycle right here? And then on back end reforms, I'm still working on that. I've been in my job for officially a year yesterday. And so I am working to figure out how we also work with those youth and young adults, and even adults who were youth and young adults when they went into the system. How can we ensure that when they get out, they are given all the tools necessary to succeed so that this one moment in their life, this one blip in their life is not the defining moment of it. So that's some of the work I've been doing. I'm really excited to dig deeper into it this year and hopefully keep you all updated.
Thanks, Ari. I love the community solutions in happening in progress in Buffalo. I
Yeah,
grew up not too far away from there, so I have a special place in my heart for that region.
they are doing amazing work. And I will say, just in terms of the community solutions portion, a part of our work at the AFCS, a big part of it is ensuring that we're not going into communities and telling them what they need to do and how they should reform their communities, but we're going to communities and asking them, what is it that you need to make this the community that you want to see? And how can we, as the forum, serve in helping you reach this mission? So the work that we do is really community driven, with us as supports in any way that we can actually serve. So I really consider this a very service oriented job because we are taking our guidance from the people who are on the ground day to day.
Yes. Yeah, and I really like how you're not trying to dictate what they're doing, which is great. And
Yeah.
I think that's how I'm gonna pivot to Brian, because I know you were mentioning that you teach classes on civil discourse, and that you're also not telling them what to do, but you actually teach your students how to discuss controversial topics. So how do you do that, especially in this day and age when we've got a lot of Americans on different sides of the coin, or just not, there's less of a civil discourse sometimes, and sometimes people just jump in and they're like, ready to like spar with each other. So how do you make it more civil, Brian?
Yeah, so I really do think civil discourse is the foundation for citizenry and civic engagement. We have to listen to each other and we have to see each other. I love this quote from Martin Luther King. He describes his time after he got his PhD in Boston. He went down to Montgomery, took the pastorate of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, took a look around the city of Montgomery, and he said, the city isn't engaged in overt violence, but he was deeply concerned about what was happening in Montgomery, because he described this sort of separateness that existed between Black Americans and white Americans. And he said, I'm concerned we hate each other because we fear each other, and we fear each other because we don't know each other. We don't know each other because we don't communicate with each other, and we don't communicate with each other because we're separated from each other. He said that in Stride Toward Freedom. And so the sort of the foundation of a strong democracy is actually listening and looking at each other. It's what Jane Addams said, that we can't practice democracy in some sequestered place, but we have to go into the crowded and thronged road where we at least see the size of one another's burdens. And so discourse is a big part of that. And so the way I do it in my classes is to really employ literature and poems, short stories that sort of lay a trap for students in a lot of ways, because they read stories and they enter into the lives of a character and they begin to understand that character a little bit. And what I try not to do is bring up a given controversial topic of the day. What do you think about this policy or that policy or this thing people are arguing about? But rather sort of just portray it in the lives of sort of real people that are portrayed in fiction. And so that we can begin to understand people on how given policies might affect a given individual. Or, for example, just sort of some abstract concept. Just so as some small example, Robert Frost has a wonderful and famous poem called Mending Wall. It describes about how the narrator once a year or occasionally goes and fixes a wall that is a boundary between himself and his neighbor, and they don't talk much. Ironically, this process of building a wall brings these neighbors together in a joint activity. And the neighbor says, good fences make good neighbors. And the narrator ponders that a little bit. And so my students pondered that a little bit. To what extent do good fences make good neighbors? Let's think about that. And then I might spring on them, well, how does this affect anything about what you think about Donald Trump's border wall? And I think that for me is a better way to think about it. So we can think in a little bit more maybe generalized way before we get into a specific given policy issue, because we tend to bring our our preconceived ideas to the table. But also fiction helps us, again, enter into the lives of others and say, okay, you think this, you think you can raise yourself up by your bootstraps. How would that little girl in the story we're reading called The Lesson, in which these groups of children from Harlem go down to FAO Schwartz, taken by a teacher, and she lifted herself up by her bootstraps, like, what is she up against here? What are some of her challenges here? Like, that philosophy doesn't hold up as well now that I read this story, because this little girl has her challenges. So anyways, fiction is, I think, a good way to enter into the lives of others, and it helps us to talk and get into some arguments in a slightly different way.
It feels like part of the key of that is bringing it down to a very human, personal, empathetic level. Like when I'm thinking about the mending wall and the way you've described it, I could see a lot of students bringing it down to the idea of boundaries, which is a lot of the discourse that people are talking about right now. And that's very personal. So that sounds like that's a big part of what it brings down to allow people to have discourse on a very civil level.
Yeah, exactly. So what do we think in general about boundaries? Are those okay or not okay? What are the problems that boundaries cause? How do they separate us? And that's not a good thing. But do they have a use at certain times? So let's talk sort of abstractly about that, and certainly about the lives of these two neighbors who are working together, and they're trying to negotiate themselves as neighbors and what they led into each other's lives, before we get into some specifics and the usual argumentation that we have about a given subject. And really that issue of empathy is huge. To what extent can I enter into the lives of others, and maybe somebody who's different than me, a different faith, a different orientation, a different race, different culture, different socioeconomic background. But stories can really help us do that.
So I think we have some different questions for you now, and I think I will turn to Ari for this next one. Ari, could you tell us where you get your inspiration from in difficult times?
I get my inspiration from my grandmother, Gammy. She is my favorite person on this earth. She is the reason that I have such gumption in this world. She always made it okay to be myself, even as quirky as I was. And in terms of daring to do things that don't seem doable, she told me that the worst anyone can do is say no. And so when I was drafting this bill, when it was moving through the Illinois General Assembly, and there was pushback to it and folks doubted me, I was okay with that. I knew from GAM that I didn't need everyone to quite understand what I was doing, but that it was going to go forth. I needed just enough people to go and understand what I was doing to vote for this bill, and they did. And I just really, I'm so grateful to her, because I don't know that I could have done anything that I've done without her in my head, on my phone some days, telling me the day before I took the bar exam for the first time that it was okay, I was going to pass because God told her so. And she was right, by the way. But I'm so grateful to her, certainly to my whole family, my parents, my sisters, but Yolanda Jones is absolutely where I get this from and why I get this.
A true mentor for you.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what about you, Brian?
Well, I should do the right thing like Ari and name a family member to make them happy if they watch this, but I don't know. I believe in a really strong sense of duty, that we do things sometimes when we don't even want to do them, but that's a little bit of what civic duty may be. There's a short piece I used by Rousseau in his Reveries of a Solitary Walker. I think it's the 8th Walk, and he talks about basically becoming weary of well-doing. He gets into the habit, he's kind of roped into this habit of giving to this boy who asks for help on the streets of Paris, and it becomes tiresome after a while. And he has this phrase called the habits of virtue, which I thought was interesting, and I myself and had my students ponder it a little bit. And what I think it means is finding that thing that's bigger than you, whatever that may be. It might be your faith, it could be your desire for justice, it could be your pursuit of a noble thing that is bigger than you, could be the preservation of the environment, which ought to be around for far outlast us, hopefully. And if you think about the great leaders of figures of service and justice, King, Mandela, Gandhi, all these people, they spent long and lonely hours in prison cells. And I can't imagine that it was to, they were enjoying the accolades of their fame. It wasn't to have their name praised here and there. I think they had a compelling vision for what they desired to see in their communities or among their people or in their countries. And so that was the thing that kept them going during the long hours. So, to me, is to find that thing that's bigger than you and to maintain some level of duty to it, because at times it's hard. Like, it's on a Saturday morning and it's rainy and cold. I'd rather stay in my nice, comfy, warm bed. I don't want to get up and coach that team. I don't want to go help at the homeless shelter. But maybe you do it and that keeps you going during the times of duty. If you want to be a teacher, oh, it's great in the first few years, so exciting. I love my kids. I get to decorate my classroom. But give it 10 years in and some of that newness and joy could potentially wear off. But maybe there's that something that's important to you that keeps you going. So that for me is it to try to find that sense of, like, on the days that are difficult, to have some sense of duty just to keep going, because there's something bigger than me out there.
And when did you find that, Brian? Do you remember that moment?
I've had my own journey of the things that are important to me that keep me going. But I think it took me a while, because I think we serve and help others for a wide variety of reasons. And that just happens to be mine. I think I thought about it for a while and realized that I had a strong, compelling sense of duty. Now, that's not to say I don't get pleasure out of it, as many people do. It doesn't help my emotions as it does for many people, or a sense of being empowered or actually feeling effective in the world. All those things are great, right? And a reason why we engage in service and helping others. But that was just mine, personally.
So I know we have a few other questions. I don't know if Asha, you want to take them, or if you want me to lead off with one of them.
Oh, you can go ahead and lead off.
Sure. So this, I feel like, leads me into another purpose-driven question, which is to ask both of you, when did you know that you wanted to be the career that you're in now?
I'll go ahead and go. So I was working in the nonprofit sector for my first job out of my master's degree, but I really did miss being on a college campus. There was just something about it and about that time in your life in which you make important decisions and have the kinds of conversations that sometimes can come up hard a little bit later in life. And I love college students. They are nutty and wacky, but also open-minded, willing sometimes to change their minds. And we make important decisions in college. Sometimes we decide what we're going to do, who we're going to do it with, where we're going to do it. And that was all very exciting to me. And so I was able to get a job at my alma mater in Florida and really loved working with students. And I also saw this ability to kind of help them to think and change their lives about things. They thought that they were going to go and be an accountant, or they were going to take over their parents' business or something. And then I had an opportunity to work with them working in St. Petersburg, Florida on some challenging issues, or going abroad and doing something very unusual and different. And I saw students sometimes changing their minds, and just that pleasure of having those conversations. So for me, it was my early 30s, until I really had that realization. I was like, maybe I'm probably going to retire from higher education. And just that ability to be in a classroom for me with a group of students and help them think through and wrestle over an issue. And for them to come up later and say, I felt myself changing my mind. Or even the most best thing that any student could ever say to a professor, which is, I was arguing about this thing we were discussing in the classroom in my dorm with my roommates. And we disagreed and we got into this big thing. I was like, oh my God, I don't care what you said or what you talked about. I'm just happy that you were thinking about it and talking about it outside the classroom. So I love that. And I kind of realized that joy could be there in my early 30s. And so, yeah, I've stuck with it.
I love hearing that it was a journey to it, because often there's a lot of pressure to feel like you need to find out your career right out of undergrad.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we have interns right now who are saying, I don't know what I'm doing. It's my last semester, and they're really worried,
Yeah.
So I think it probably also, for our listeners who don't necessarily know what they want to do in their 20s or even in their 30s, it's helpful hearing stories like yours to see that it can take a while to find what you want to do.
I think that's real common. I'm 23. Why don't I have it all figured out? What is my career going to be? Why hasn't everything fallen into place? And it takes time, and you figure these things out. It's a bit of a journey. And the good news is if you're lucky, you can poke around a little bit and look around, but also look at people. Like, who are the people who inspire you? Is there anybody in your life who you look at and say, I like that person. I'd like to live their life. They're doing something interesting or meaningful or fun. And so you can take your time to figure those things out.
That's great. What about you, Ari? When did you know that you wanted to do the career you have at the moment?
I'm really sorry to say, I knew I was going to be an attorney when I was 12.
That's okay.
That is when I told my family that I was going to be an attorney, and I stuck with it. Um, this is not the type of attorney I thought I would be. I thought I was going to graduate from college. I was moving to Birmingham. I was born and raised in Mobile, Alabama, so I could not really conceive of a world outside of the South, and still can't believe that I do live outside of the South right now. But I thought I was going to go and move to Birmingham after law school. I was going to become an attorney and eventually a judge. All of that got turned on its head. I did eventually go to law school after my Fulbright. I still stuck with the notion that I was going to do something that served the public. So I knew I was not going to go and practice corporate law. But I didn't start out as an attorney. My first year out of law school, I investigated housing discrimination claims in Louisiana and Mississippi. My second year out, I went back to my hometown of Mobile and worked for a federal judge. I was a fellow focusing on children's education issues in Florida with the Southern Poverty Law Center. Then I moved to Chicago, where I worked for a prosecutor's office, which I never thought I would do as a non-prosecutor, but I did that for several years. And now I am not practicing in the traditional sense. I didn't see any of this from 21 years ago. 12-year-old me did not know that any of these things was actually possible, first of all. But even 25-year-old me with a degree in hand did not see this as my trajectory. And I'm so grateful for it, because in each of those roles, I was able to affect some type of change in my community, whether it was pointing out that the same prison guards were accused of abusing prisoners in prisoner civil rights claims, whether it was stumbling upon a really egregious case of housing discrimination in the Jackson area, or helping to revamp our clemency policies in Chicago so that more than 30 people were granted clemency by the governor. All of these things, they don't really seem to fit together, but they do. They still have that common thread of being of service, especially to my local community. But just my mind was so small at 12, because you just don't know what you don't know, that I couldn't have conceived that any of this was going to happen, or that it was even possible. And even now, I am in this amazing role where I get to really work to dedicate time and space and fiscal resources to the people and organizations who are on the ground day in and day out doing this amazing work to make their spaces better. I don't know what comes next. And so I started with this foundation of I'm going to get this law degree, and everything has just kind of grown out of that. And then the idea of service was really also reinforced in college. I was a Bonner Scholar at Spelman College, which is a women's historically Black college in Atlanta. And as a Bonner Scholar, your scholarship is based on community service in exchange for giving you this amazing opportunity at an even more amazing education. You agree to dedicate most of your college experience to community service. And so I spent my 4 years there completing well over 1,000 hours of community service. And I that really is what reinforced to me for the first time the ability of people on the ground to change the world by making those small steps in their community. by helping a student with their writing, by supervising kids when they went to visit their mothers who were incarcerated, by helping to write grants for different organizations. All of that led to really where I am now and wherever I will go from here.
I feel like that's the other side of the coin of talking about the evolution of a career, right? And the things that we can't imagine, even if we know from the age of 12. And I'm sure we all know friends who, from that age said, I'm going to be a doctor, and now they're a doctor, but the career evolves from there.
Exactly. Yeah. And speaking of evolution, you mentioned your Fulbright, and I was just wondering, how did what effect did the Fulbright experience have on your career, and how did it blend in with the service aspect?
Fulbright was an amazing experience. I can't believe it was over a decade ago now, but it taught me so many lessons that really continue to resonate to this day. One, and one of the most important, is humility. There is nothing like trying to traverse a foreign country in a language that is not your first, and trying to traverse the cultural differences that will humble you more. And I say that in honestly the most grateful of ways. It was really easy to say, oh, I got this Fulbright, now the hard part is over. Teaching children is not easy. Kudos to every teacher out there, particularly those in the American public education system. But it just taught me so much humility. It also taught me to listen. I learned so much about Madrid and about Spain in general, honestly, from having conversations with my kids, from striking a random conversation with conversations with elders on the metro. Like, that's how you really learn, and it's how you really like immerse yourself in a culture. And that ability to genuinely sit and listen to people, to absorb what they are saying, has been an amazing resource, particularly as I worked with incarcerated people and had to sit and not necessarily hear them, but read their letters. It's tough to see someone write out in their own handwriting, not type print, but to write out for 20, 30 pages their entire life story, the entire just background of their crimes and their entire experience after decades in prison. And it is hard to do that, to really stay present and absorb what they are saying so that you can try to infuse a little more grace into a very graceless system. And so those are two of the lessons that I learned. I also learned how to just really engage with people who don't share the same background as me. So sociopolitically, just because of our cultural backgrounds, because of status, incarcerated versus not incarcerated, it really taught me to treat everyone with the same level of courtesy and respect that I would hope that I could receive in return. And so those are things that kind of continue to resonate with me even a decade on. And I'm sure there will be more lessons that will reveal themselves in time too.
I'm going to turn that same question to you, Brian. You actually have experienced both working with Mandela Washington Fellows, and you've been on the U.S. Speaker Program. So how did those two experiences shape your career?
Oh, yeah. And I also had the privilege of doing some reciprocal exchanges too, which is another, I guess, count myself as an alumni in that regard. So the Mandela program is great. It brings, it's a highly competitive program of about 700 fellows out of 40,000 applicants, truly bringing the best of the best from sub-Saharan Africa to the United States to study either entrepreneurship, public administration, or civic leadership. And our institute was focused on civic leadership. We got 25 of those fellows and got to know them well. For me, it was like getting up every day and going to 19 different countries. And so that is wonderful. And I had much to learn, but also like interesting and deep questions that would come up about our own society through those interactions. One Monday morning, I remember after a weekend of homestays, we put the fellows on homestays. I remember a young man from Liberia coming back to the classroom and saying, I saw something this weekend that I could not believe. And he had been riding through this area up here in Western North Carolina and came upon a honor system vegetable stand. And for him, he really thought that through. He's like, I have to tell you, in my community, if you put it on an honor stand, not only would the money be gone, but the vegetables and the table too. And he was lamenting this, but then it also opened up this conversation about like, well, what would it mean in a society to be able to have an honor stand? And by the way, we can't have honor stands everywhere in the United States. So don't, get that idea out of your head. But why does it work here in this particular region? Like, what is going on here? What is it a part of our society that's interesting? So like those kinds of conversations, or long, friendly ones on long van rides, are just wonderful. And then the opportunity for me to collaborate with some of those Mandela Fellow alumni. I just got back from Benin, where I was collaborating with a fantastic 2021 fellow to promote girls' persistence in education through civic engagement, participation, but also the distribution of reusable menstruation pads is an important issue. Period poverty is an important issue in many parts of the world. So all that is wonderful. And then with regards to the speakers program, it's just been amazing pleasure to meet with often young people who want to make a difference in their communities, identify problems in their communities. And the wonderful part about it for me is that regardless of the political situation that one might be facing, individual citizens can still make a positive difference. So yeah, we might be frustrated with the guy in office right now, not like it, think the elections are a sham, but I know I can make a difference in my neighborhood. And so then suddenly I'm empowered, whereas before I felt rather disempowered and frustrated. And so that's exciting. Again, young people who I have identified really important issues, or sometimes I get the pleasure of working with academics and they want to integrate service into the pedagogy. So they understand, as we do here at my university, that we want to train really competent accountants and historians and physicists and dancers, but we want civically engaged accountants and historians and physicists and dancers, young people who take the skills that we've taught them to make a contribution to the greater good. So I get the pleasure of talking with academics who are interested in the same thing. So it's just been amazing. I've had the pleasure of talking with groups in Indonesia and Ethiopia and Malaysia, Colombia, Dominican Republic, Ghana, Benin, Senegal, all over. So it's just been fantastic.
That's amazing. It sounds like you've been all over. And, I also wanted to just say thank you for mentioning your CDAP project, the Citizen Diplomacy Action Fund project that you did in Benin, because actually the Citizen Diplomacy Action Fund project competition is starting this month. So that's all you U.S. alumni. You can look into that and apply. And I think with that, we are going to have to wrap up because we are running out of time. Brian and Ari, before we go, what's your number one tip for being of service to your community?
Go ahead, Ari.
Ooh, just my number one tip. I would say to listen, especially to the most dispossessed among us. We have to center the voice of the people who have been made the least of us, because it's the cries of the marginalized that are going to show us where our greatest need is. And as we meet the needs of the neediest, the only thing that can happen is that the rest of the world will also benefit. So center the voices of the marginalized.
I love to talk about a 4-step model about how we can make a difference. And it's vaguely based on James Best's idea of like moral sensitivity, moral judgment, moral motivation, and implementation. Basically, the short of it is we see the problem, we know what to do, we're willing to do something, then we actually follow through. But in each of those 4 steps have their challenges, like actually seeing the problem and laying eyes on it and getting others to do the same. Knowing what to do, that's always kind of a little tricky, right? Like what's the best solution? Overcoming discouragements and then actually taking that first step. But that discouragements issue, I think, is one to think about, right? We get discouragements sometimes from without. We have to face difficult answers to some problems that are out there. And sometimes those answers might mean us making a sacrifice or becoming involved where we heretofore didn't really want to. But sometimes we get discouragements from a lot of other people or from ourselves. We say like, oh, people who look like me, we don't speak up where I come from. Or, I'm just a teenager, or I don't have my degree, or I dropped out of high school or something like that. Well, that's a discouragement that we give ourselves sometimes. But sometimes it comes from others, people who are supposed to be in our support system saying, well, why are you doing this? You should be out making money. How come you want to spend your time helping others? Or, why you want to get up on a Saturday morning and help out in some kind of way? Why do you want to spend those long hours? Why would you want to be a lawyer, promoting justice when you could be working for some high corporate law firm, earning like sometimes those discouragements come from other places. So we have to find the ways to overcome those discouragements. But if we don't do those 4 things, the problems are going to stay there. So we have to follow those 4 steps and move forward. But then we can see ourselves making a difference. And at the end of it, say, hey, I can actually make a difference in the world. I'm not just affected on by the world, but actually I can have an effect on the world, and that is a good feeling.
Thank you to both of you. I feel like this episode has given me a lot of hope for the future and for things that everyone can do and be empowered and take charge. So thank you so much, Brian and Ari, for being with us today. And a big thank you to our listeners for participating.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Interested in learning more about awesome Exchange alumni, including Brian and Ari, visit our website at alumni.state.gov. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn to get more news and updates.
Thanks for watching, everyone, and see you all soon for our next Mentor Talks.